Chapter 7. Broken Tooth was another youngster who lived by himself. His mother lived in the caves, but two more children had come after him, and he had been thrust out to shift for himself. We had witnessed the performance during the several preceding days, and it had given us no little glee. Broken Tooth did not want to go, and every time his mother left the cave, he sneaked back into it. When she returned and found him there, her rages were delightful. Half the horde made a practice of watching for these moments. First, from within the cave would come her scolding and shrieking. Then we could hear sounds of the thrashing and the yelling of Broken Tooth. About this time the two younger children joined in, and finally, like the eruption of a miniature volcano, Broken Tooth would come flying out. At the end of several days his leaving home was accomplished. He wailed his grief unheeded from the center of the open space for at least half an hour, and then came to live with Lapierre and me. Our cave was small, but with squeezing there was room for three. I have no recollection of Broken Tooth spending more than one night with us, so the accident must have happened right away. It came in the middle of the day. In the morning we had eaten our fill of the carrots, and then, made heedless by play, we had ventured onto the big trees just beyond. I cannot understand how Lapierre got over his habitual caution, but it must have been the play. We were having a great time playing tree tag, and such tag! We leaped 10 or 15-foot gaps as a matter of course, and a 20 or 25-foot deliberate drop clear down to the ground was nothing to us. In fact, I am almost afraid to say the great distances we dropped. As we grew older and heavier, we found we had to be more cautious in dropping. But at that age our bodies were all strings and springs, and we could do anything. Broken Tooth displayed remarkable agility in the game. He was it less frequently than any of us, and in the course of the game he discovered one difficult slip that neither Lapierre nor I was able to accomplish. To be truthful, we were afraid to attempt it. When we were it, Broken Tooth always ran out to the end of a lofty branch in a certain tree. From the end of the branch to the ground it must have been 70 feet, and nothing intervened to break a fall. But about 20 feet lower down, and fully 15 feet out from the perpendicular, was the thick branch of another tree. As we ran out the limb, Broken Tooth facing us would begin teetering. This naturally impeded our progress. But there was more in the teetering than that. He teetered with his back to the jump he was to make. Just as we nearly reached him, he would let go. The teetering branch was like a springboard. It threw him far out backward as he fell, and as he fell he turned around sideways in the air so as to face the other branch into which he was falling. This branch bent far down under the impact, and sometimes there was an ominous crackling, but it never broke, and out of the leaves was always to be seen the face of Broken Tooth grinning triumphantly up at us. I was it the last time Broken Tooth tried this. He had gained the end of the branch and begun his teetering, and I was creeping out after him, when suddenly there came a low warning cry from Lapierre. I looked down and saw him in the main fork of the tree, crouching close against the trunk. Instinctively I crouched down upon the thick limb. Broken Tooth stopped teetering, but the branch would not stop, and his body continued bobbing up and down with the rustling leaves. I heard the crackle of a dry twig, and looking down, saw my first Fire Man. He was creeping stealthily along on the ground and peering up into the tree. At first I thought he was a wild animal, because he wore around his waist and over his shoulders a ragged piece of bearskin. And then I saw his hands and feet, and more clearly his features. He was very much like my kind, except that he was less hairy and that his feet were less like hands than ours. In fact, he and his people, as I was later to know, were far less hairy than we, though we, in turn, were equally less hairy than the Tree People. It came to me instantly as I looked at him. This was the terror of the northeast, of which the mystery of smoke was a token. Yet I was puzzled. Certainly he was nothing of which to be afraid. Red Eye or any of our strong men would have been more than a match for him. He was old, too, wizened with age, and the hair on his face was gray. Also, he limped badly with one leg. There was no doubt at all that we could outrun him and outclimb him. He could never catch us, that was certain. But he carried something in his hand that I had never seen before. It was a bow and arrow. But at that time a bow and arrow had no meaning for me. How was I to know that death lurked in that bent piece of wood? But Lapierre knew. He had evidently seen the Fire People before, and knew something of their ways. The Fire Man peeped up at him and circled around the tree. And around the main trunk above the fork Lapierre circled too, keeping always the trunk between himself and the Fire Man. The latter abruptly reversed his circling. Lapierre, caught unawares, also hastily reversed, but did not win the protection of the trunk until after the Fire Man had twanged the bow. I saw the arrow leap up, miss Lapierre, glance against the limb, and fall back to the ground. I danced up and down on my lofty perch with delight. It was a game. The Fire Man was throwing things at Lapierre as we sometimes threw things at one another. The game continued a little longer, but Lapierre did not expose himself a second time. Then the Fire Man gave it up. I leaned far out over my horizontal limb and chattered down at him. I wanted to play. I wanted to have him try to hit me with the thing. He saw me, but ignored me, turning his attention to Broken Tooth, who was still teetering slightly and involuntarily on the end of his branch. The first arrow leaped upward. Broken Tooth yelled with fright and pain. It had reached its mark. This put a new complexion on the matter. I no longer cared to play, but crouched tremblingly close to my limb. A second arrow and a third soared up, missing Broken Tooth, rustling the leaves as they passed through, arching in their flight and returning to earth. The Fire Man stretched his bow again. He shifted his position, walked away several steps, then shifted it a second time. The bowstring twanged, the arrow leaped upward, and Broken Tooth, uttering a terrible scream, fell off the branch. I saw him as he went down, turning over and over, all arms and legs it seemed, the shaft of the arrow projecting from his chest and appearing and disappearing with each revolution of his body. Sheer down, screaming 70 feet he fell, smashing to the earth with an audible thud and crunch, his body rebounding slightly and settling down again. Still he lived, for he moved and squirmed, clawing with his hands and feet. I remember the Fire Man running forward with a stone and hammering him on the head. And then I remembered no more. Also during my childhood, at this stage of the dream, did I wake up screaming with fright, to find often my mother or nurse, anxious and startled, by my bedside, passing soothing hands through my hair and telling me that they were there and that there was nothing to fear. My next dream, in the order of succession, begins always with the flight of Lapierre and myself through the forest. The Fire Man and Broken Tooth and the tree of the tragedy are gone. Lapierre and I, in a cautious panic, are fleeing through the trees. In my right leg is a burning pain, and from the flesh, protruding head and shaft from either side, is an arrow of the Fire Man. Not only did the pull and strain of it pain me severely, but it bothered my movements and made it impossible for me to keep up with Lapierre. At last I gave up, crouching in the secure fork of a tree. Lapierre went right on. I called to him most plaintively, I remember, and he stopped and looked back. Then he returned to me, climbing into the fork and examining the arrow. He tried to pull it out, but one way the flesh resisted the barbed lead, and the other way it resisted the feathered shaft. Also it hurt grievously, and I stopped him. For some time we crouched there, Lapierre nervous and anxious to be gone, perpetually and apprehensively peering this way and that, and myself whimpering softly and sobbing. Lapierre was plainly in a funk, and yet his conduct in remaining by me, in spite of his fear, I take as a foreshadowing of the altruism and comradeship that have helped make man the mightiest of the animals. Once again Lapierre tried to drag the arrow through the flesh, and I angrily stopped him. Then he bent down and began gnawing the shaft of the arrow with his teeth. As he did so, he held the arrow firmly in both hands so that it would not play about in the wound, and at the same time I held on to him. I often meditate upon this scene, the two of us half-grown cubs in the childhood of the race, and the one mastering his fear, beating down his selfish impulse of flight in order to stand by and succor the other. And there rises up before me all that there was there foreshadowed, and I see visions of Damon and Pythias, of life-saving crews and Red Cross nurses, of martyrs and leaders of forlorn hopes, of Father Damien, and of the Christ himself, and of all the men of earth, mighty of stature, whose strength may trace back to the elemental loins of Lapierre and Big Tooth and other dim denizens of the Younger World. When Lapierre had chewed off the head of the arrow, the shaft was withdrawn easily enough. I started to go on, but this time it was he that stopped me. My leg was bleeding profusely. Some of the smaller veins had doubtless been ruptured. Running out to the end of a branch, Lapierre gathered a handful of green leaves. These he stuffed into the wound. They accomplished the purpose, for the bleeding soon stopped. Then we went on together, back to the safety of the caves. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8. Well do I remember that first winter after I had left home. I have long dreams of sitting shivering in the cold. Lapierre and I sit close together, with our arms and legs about each other, blue-faced with chattering teeth. It got particularly crisp along toward morning. In those chill early hours we slept little, huddling together in numb misery, and waiting for the sunrise in order to get warm. When we went outside there was a crackle of frost underfoot. One morning we discovered ice on the surface of the quiet water in the eddy, where was the drinking place, and there was a great how do you do about it. Old Marrowbone was the oldest member of the horde, and he had never seen anything like it before. I remember the worried, plaintive look that came into his eyes as he examined the ice. This plaintive look always came into our eyes when we did not understand a thing, or when we felt the prod of some vague and inexpressible desire. Red Eye, too, when he investigated the ice, looked bleak and plaintive, and stared across the river into the northeast, as though in some way he connected the Fire People with this latest happening. But we found ice only on that one morning, and that was the coldest winter we experienced. I have no memory of other winters when it was so cold. I have often thought that the cold winter was a forerunner of the countless cold winters to come, as the ice sheet from farther north crept down over the face of the land. But we never saw that ice sheet. Many generations must have passed before the descendants of the horde migrated south, or remained and adapted themselves to the changed conditions. Life was hit or miss and happy-go-lucky with us. Little was ever planned, and less was executed. We ate when we were hungry, drank when we were thirsty, avoided our carnivorous enemies, took shelter in the caves at night, and for the rest just sort of played along through life. We were very curious, easily amused, and full of tricks and pranks. There was no seriousness about us, except when we were in danger or were angry, in which cases the one was quickly forgotten, and the other as quickly got over. We were inconsecutive, illogical, and inconsequential. We had no steadfastness of purpose, and it was here that the Fire People were ahead of us. They possessed all these things of which we possessed so little. Occasionally, however, especially in the realm of the emotions, we were capable of long-cherished purpose. The faithfulness of the monogamic couples I have referred to may be explained as a matter of habit. But my long desire for the Swift One cannot be so explained, any more than can be explained the undying enmity between me and Red Eye. But it was our inconsequentiality and stupidity that especially distresses me when I look back upon that life in the long ago. Once I found a broken gourd which happened to lie right side up, and which had been filled with the rain. The water was sweet, and I drank it. I even took the gourd down to the stream and filled it with more water, some of which I drank, and some of which I poured over Lapierre. And then I threw the gourd away. It never entered my head to fill the gourd with water and carry it into my cave. Yet often I was thirsty at night, especially after eating wild onions and watercress, and no one ever dared leave the caves at night for a drink. Another time I found a dry gourd, inside of which the seeds rattled. I had fun with it for a little while, but it was a plaything, nothing more. And yet it was not long after this that the using of gourds for storing water became the general practice of the horde. But I was not the inventor. The honor was due to old Marrowbone, and it is fair to assume that it was the necessity of his great age that brought about the innovation. At any rate, the first member of the horde to use gourds was Marrowbone. He kept a supply of drinking water in his cave, which cave belonged to his son, the Hairless One, who permitted him to occupy a corner of it. We used to see Marrowbone filling his gourd at the drinking place and carrying it carefully up to his cave. Imitation was strong in the Folk, and first one, and then another and another, procured a gourd, and used it in similar fashion, until it was a general practice with all of us so to store water. Sometimes old Marrowbone had sick spells, and was unable to leave the cave. Then it was that the Hairless One filled the gourd for him. A little later the Hairless One deputed the task to Longlip, his son. And after that, even when Marrowbone was well again, Longlip continued carrying water for him. By and by, except on unusual occasions, the men never carried any water at all, leaving the task to the women and larger children. Lapierre and I were independent. We carried water only for ourselves, and we often mocked the young water-carriers when they were called away from play to fill the gourds. Progress was slow with us. We played through life, even the adults, much in the same way that children play, and we played as none of the other animals played. What little we learned was usually in the course of play, and was due to our curiosity and keenness of appreciation. For that matter, the one big invention of the horde during the time I lived with it was the use of gourds. At first we stored only water in the gourds, in imitation of old Marrowbone. But one day some one of the women, I do not know which one, filled the gourd with blackberries and carried it to her cave. In no time all the women were carrying berries and nuts and roots in the gourds. This idea, once started, had to go on. Another evolution of the carrying receptacle was due to women. Without doubt, some woman's gourd was too small, or else she had forgotten her gourd. But be that as it may, she bent two great leaves together, pinning the seams with twigs, and carried home a bigger quantity of berries than could have been contained in the largest gourd. So far we got, and no farther in the transportation of supplies during the years I lived with the Folk. It never entered anybody's head to weave a basket out of willow withes. Sometimes the men and women tied tough vines about the bundles of ferns and branches that they carried to the caves to sleep upon. Possibly in 10 or 20 generations we might have worked up to the weaving of baskets. And of this one thing is sure. If once we wove withes into baskets, the next and inevitable step would have been in the weaving of cloth. Clothes would have followed, and with covering our nakedness would have come modesty. Thus was momentum gained in the younger world. But we were without this momentum. We were just getting started, and we could not go far in a single generation. We were without weapons, without fire, and in the raw beginnings of speech. The device of writing lay so far in the future that I am appalled when I think of it. Even I was once on the verge of a great discovery. To show you how fortuitous was development in those days, let me state that had it not been for the gluttony of Lapierre, I might have brought about the domestication of the dog. And this was something that the Fire People who lived to the northeast had not yet achieved. They were without dogs, for I knew this from observation. But let me tell you how Lapierre's gluttony possibly set back our social development many generations. Well to the west of our caves was a great swamp, but to the south lay a stretch of low, rocky hills. These were little frequented for two reasons. First of all, there was no food there of the kind we ate. And next, those rocky hills were filled with the lairs of carnivorous beasts. But Lapierre and I strayed over to the hills one day. We would have not strayed had we not been teasing a tiger. Please do not laugh. It was old Saber-Tooth himself. We were perfectly safe. We chanced upon him in the forest early in the morning, and from the safety of the branches overhead we chattered down at him our dislike and hatred. And from branch to branch, and from tree to tree, we followed overhead, making an infernal row and warning all the forest dwellers that old Saber-Tooth was coming. We spoiled his hunting for him anyway, and we made him good and angry. He snarled at us and lashed his tail, and sometimes he paused and stared up at us quietly for a long time, as if debating in his mind some way by which he could get hold of us. But we only laughed and pelted him with twigs and the ends of branches. This tiger baiting was common sport among the Folk. Sometimes half the horde would follow from overhead a tiger or lion that had ventured out in the daytime. It was our revenge, for more than one member of the horde caught unexpectedly had gone the way of the tiger's belly or the lion's. Also, by such ordeals of helplessness and shame, we taught the hunting animals to some extent to keep out of our territory. And then it was funny. It was a great game. And so Lapierre and I had chased Saber Tooth across 3 miles of forest. Toward the last he put his tail between his legs and fled from our gibing like a beaten cur. We did our best to keep up with him, but when we reached the edge of the forest he was no more than a streak in the distance. I don't know what prompted us, unless it was curiosity, but after playing around a while, Lapierre and I ventured across the open ground to the edge of the rocky hills. We did not go far. Possibly at no time were we more than 100 yards from the trees. Coming around a sharp corner of rock, we went very carefully, because we did not know what we might encounter. We came upon 3 puppies playing in the sun. They did not see us, and we watched them for some time. They were wild dogs. In the rock wall was a horizontal fissure, evidently the lair where their mother had left them, and where they should have remained had they been obedient. But the growing life that in Lapierre and me had impelled us to venture away from the forest had driven the puppies out of the cave to frolic. I know how their mother would have punished them had she caught them. But it was Lapierre and I who caught them. He looked at me, and then we made a dash for it. The puppies knew no place to run except into the lair, and we headed them off. One rushed between my legs. I squatted and grabbed him. He sank his sharp little teeth into my arm, and I dropped him in the suddenness of the hurt and surprise. The next moment he had scurried inside.